I've never been one for superstition. I never believed in ghosts or things that go bump in the night. But that all changed the moment I agreed to venture into the Rocky Mountains with my friends, hoping to document a story about an abandoned cabin hidden deep in the woods. It was said to be cursed empty for years, with whispers of mysterious disappearances. My name's Ethan Carter. I'm a filmmaker, and I was determined to get the truth. We started our hike in the early morning. The air was thin, the snow barely starting to accumulate on the ground. Our group, Lily, Jake, and Sam, were used to tough hikes, but the climb grew steeper with each passing hour. The sun was already starting to dip behind the mountains when the storm hit. A violent wind, accompanied by thick snow, swirled around us, turning the world into a blur of white. We had no choice but to push forward. Visibility dropped to 0. I could barely make out the shapes of my friends around me. Sam, always the optimist, kept reassuring us, but even his voice cracked under the weight of the storm. After what felt like hours, we spotted a silhouette against the snow, a cabin. Its sagging roof and darkened windows looked like something from a forgotten nightmare. It was cold, darker than the surroundings, yet something in it beckoned us. We forced the door open with a rusty screech that echoed unnervingly in the silence. The interior was just as desolate, covered in layers of dust and decay. The smell of rot lingered, and the silence was thick, suffocating. I felt an unnatural chill crawl up my spine the moment we stepped inside. I tried to brush it off. We needed shelter for the night, and the storm was relentless. Little did I know this would be the place where everything would change. We tried to make the best of it. The cold was unbearable, but we lit a fire in the old stone fireplace and settled into the creaky chairs around it. As the fire crackled, Lily, ever the dreamer, started to tell stories about the cabin. They were just old tales, people who'd gone missing, hikers who'd never returned. I laughed it off, dismissing it as campfire nonsense. But then I heard it, a whisper, soft but clear, coming from somewhere inside the walls. At first, I thought it was the wind, or my tired mind playing tricks. But then Lily's face went pale. She asked if we heard it too. Sam and Jake exchanged uneasy glances, but I shrugged it off. It's probably the cabin settling, I said, trying to sound confident, but even I wasn't sure anymore. The whisper continued, soft as a breath, just out of earshot. Something was very wrong here. The storm outside howled louder, almost as if the mountain itself was angry. That night, we took turns sleeping, though I doubt any of us truly rested. Every so often, I would wake to the sound of creaking floorboards, or the faintest of whispers, always just on the edge of hearing. I remember staring at the ceiling waiting for sleep to come, when Lily's scream sliced through the silence. I jumped out of bed and rushed to her side. Her eyes were wide with terror, and her breath came in short, frantic gasps. Lily claimed she had seen something crouched over me while I slept. She described it as a shadow, moving like it was part of the dark, something that didn't belong. She couldn't tell if it had a face, or if it was just a mass of shifting darkness. I tried to reassure her, to convince her it was just a nightmare, but the look in her eyes told me otherwise. We all huddled together, too frightened to sleep. None of us spoke. We just stared at the door, waiting. Morning came, but it didn't bring any relief. The storm outside had not abated, and the cabin felt colder than before. As we prepared breakfast in silence, we noticed that something was wrong. Jake was missing. His backpack was gone, his sleeping bag unzipped. We searched the cabin frantically, but there was no trace of him. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to understand what had happened. The door had been shut. No sign of struggle, no noise, just gone. Jake's footprints led outside, but they stopped in the middle of the snow. There was no sign of struggle, no evidence of him being dragged. It was as though he had simply vanished. I couldn't make sense of it. "It's the mountain," Sam said, his voice hollow. "We should have left when we had the chance." But there was nowhere to go. The storm raged on, and we were trapped. We had no choice but to stay and figure out what happened to Jake. Paranoia set in quickly. Every creak of the cabin's walls seemed to echo with a deeper meaning. We had come for an adventure, for a documentary, but now we were part of something far darker than we had imagined. I pulled out my camera, hoping to capture some semblance of the truth. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Each time I turned the lens away, I felt as though something in the corner of my vision was shifting, moving. That night, I found an old journal wedged beneath the floorboards. It belonged to someone who had been here long before us, someone who had experienced the same terror. The entry that stood out read, "It knows when you see it. Don't look." I felt a chill run through me as I read those words aloud. The others exchanged uneasy glances. But just as I finished, a breath, cold and ragged, brushed the back of my neck. I spun around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there. The cabin grew colder with each passing hour. It was as if the very walls were alive, pulsing with an energy I couldn't explain. We stayed close, huddled together by the fire. But that night, Sam vanished. No footprints, no sounds, just an empty space where he had been. We searched again, but there was no trace of him. Not even a hint of struggle. It was as though he had simply ceased to exist. Lily and I were the last two left. Despair hung heavy in the air as we sat in silence, our eyes darting nervously around the cabin. I tried to convince myself that there had to be a rational explanation, but deep down I knew there wasn't. Something was out there, something ancient, and it was hunting us. I turned my camera on Lily, hoping that recording might provide some proof of our existence. Proof of the truth. We made the decision to leave. The storm outside had subsided, and though the snow was still thick, we thought it might be our only chance to escape. I packed up the camera and my things, but just as we reached the door, I heard it again. The whisper. This time it was louder, more insistent. It was as if the voice was coming from the walls themselves, seeping into my mind. "You're not leaving." Lily froze beside me, her eyes wide with fear. I tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was as though the cabin itself was keeping us inside, refusing to let us go. I pulled at the handle, my muscles straining, but it was useless. The walls creaked, the floorboards groaned beneath our feet, and the whispering grew louder, filling the air with dread. I turned to Lily, my heart racing. She was no longer standing beside me. She was gone. No trace of her. No footsteps. Nothing. Just an empty space where she had been. I stumbled back, my mind spiraling into panic. How was this happening? What was taking her? I felt a presence behind me. A cold, heavy weight pressing against my back. I turned, but there was nothing. Just the shadows, the whispering, and the suffocating air. It was as though the cabin was closing in on me, suffocating me, trapping me in its twisted grip. I spent hours, maybe days, wandering the cabin, my thoughts fragmented, disjointed. It was impossible to tell time in this cursed place. The shadows moved in unnatural ways, and the walls seemed to breathe in rhythm with my heartbeat. I could feel something watching me, Something ancient, something hungry. It whispered my name, coaxing me, tempting me to look into the darkness to see what lay beyond. I couldn't resist anymore. The urge to look was overwhelming. I turned the camera on myself, the lens shaking in my hands. "If you see this," I whispered, my voice trembling with fear, "don't come here." The words felt like a warning, but they were already too late. I could hear it now, the heavy, ragged breathing behind me. I turned, and there it was, a shape in the darkness. The shape was darker than the night itself, a shadow with no form, no face, no identity. It was everything and nothing. My breath caught in my throat as the shape moved closer. I stumbled back, but it followed. I could feel its cold fingers brushing against my skin, its presence suffocating me. My heart raced in terror as I backed away. The camera still recording. The screen began to glitch, the image distorting. The camera fell from my hands. The last thing I saw was the dark shape reaching out, and then the screen went black. The next thing I remember is waking up to an empty cabin. The fire had long since died out. There was no sign of Lily, Jake, or Sam. No sign of anyone. I was alone. But the whispering still lingered in the air, just out of reach. I could feel the presence of the mountain, its curse, closing in on me. The storm had passed, but it didn't matter. I knew I wouldn't survive. I knew it was coming for me, just as it had come for them. The mountain had claimed us all. The legend was true. We were all part of it now. Another chapter in its dark history. I couldn't outrun it. I couldn't escape. And as the darkness closed in around me, I realized something far worse. I wasn't meant to leave. None of us were. Days later, a search team found the cabin. They found the camera, buried in the snow, still intact, still recording. There were no bodies, no signs of the friends I had once known. Only the wind, carrying their voices on the air. Soft whispers that echoed in the stillness. And somewhere, just beyond the horizon, the shadow of the mountain waited, hungry and patient for its next victims. The search team combed through the area, their steps marking the snow in sharp contrast to the pristine wilderness. They found nothing. No bodies, no signs of struggle, no trace that anyone had ever been there. It was as if we had never existed, swallowed whole by the mountain. But the camera was all that remained left behind, as if it were a beacon for something darker. The footage, too, was proof of our terror, a testament to the curse we had inadvertently awakened. The authorities dismissed the story as a tragic accident, a group of friends lost in the wilderness during a freak storm. But deep down, I knew the truth. There was no accident here. There was something malevolent in the air, something ancient that had claimed our lives, and it would continue to claim those foolish enough to venture too close to the peak. The shadow that lurked just beyond the reach of the human eye. Weeks passed, and the memory of that night began to fade, replaced by the routine of life, the hustle and bustle of the world I once knew. But I couldn't forget. I couldn't escape what I had witnessed, the shadow, the whispers, the feeling of being hunted by something far older than I could comprehend. My dreams were plagued by images of that cursed cabin, its walls alive with movement, the dark shape always just behind me. I tried to convince myself it was over, that it was just a bad memory, a story to tell and forget. But the whispers never truly left me. At night, when the wind howled outside my window, I could hear it. Faint at first, but growing louder as the darkness deepened. "You're not safe," it would say. You'll never be free. I tried to ignore it, but the voice became a constant presence, gnawing at the edges of my mind, reminding me of what I had left behind. I couldn't stop thinking about the others. Jake, Sam, Lily. They had vanished without a trace, absorbed by the mountain, lost in its cold embrace. I wondered if they, too, could still hear it. Could they hear the whispers that haunted me? Were they trapped like I was, forever bound to the peak, their souls wandering in the dark? Or had they been consumed, their spirits claimed by the curse that had taken them so easily? One night, driven by desperation and the need for answers, I returned to the mountains. I couldn't stay away. I needed to know why we had been chosen, why we had been dragged into this nightmare. The cabin was still there, standing in the same place, shrouded in snow, just as I remembered. The storm had come again, though weaker this time, and the air was thick with the same oppressive silence. But as I stepped closer, I felt it, the presence, just beyond the trees. The wind had stopped, and the world was still. My breath echoed in the cold air, and my feet crunched against the snow, each step heavier than the last. The cabin loomed ahead, its rotting timbers casting long shadows in the moonlight. I could feel it now, the weight of the mountain pressing against me, urging me to turn back. But I was too far gone to listen. I needed to understand. I pushed open the door, the familiar rusted squeak filling the silence. Inside, the cabin was just as it had been when we first arrived, old, decaying, and lifeless. But something was different this time. The air was heavier, thick with a presence I couldn't shake. I stood still for a moment listening. The whispering was there, just out of reach, always on the edge of my hearing. And then it stopped. I felt it. That horrible stillness, as if the mountain was watching, waiting. I moved cautiously, the camera still in my hand, the lens shaking. It was almost as if I had come back here with the sole purpose of capturing the very thing that had stolen my friends. The fire pit was cold, the floorboards warped and splintering beneath my feet. And yet, the sense of being watched grew stronger. My heart raced as I turned around, expecting to see something, anything. But there was nothing, only the silence. And then, the whisper again. "Leave," it said, cold and insistent. "You should never have come back." The words sent a shiver down my spine. I turned the camera on, focusing on the dark corners of the room. The light from the lens flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. That's when I saw it, a figure, darker than the shadows themselves, standing motionless in the corner. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. It was the same dark shape I had seen before, the one that had haunted my every step. I stepped backward, but the shadow moved with me, always a few steps behind. It was so close now, its presence suffocating. Its shape so indistinct, yet undeniably there. My hands shook as I reached for the door, my mind screaming at me to leave. But the door wouldn't open. The shadow grew closer, its form blurring and shifting as if it was merging with the darkness around it. I could hear its breath now, ragged and cold, right behind me. In that moment, I understood. The mountain wasn't just a place, it was a force. A hunger that devoured those who dared to trespass. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a creature. It was the mountain itself, alive, sentient, and always watching. It fed on fear, on the terror of those who ventured too far. And now I was its next meal. I turned to face it, the camera still running, still capturing my final moments. The shadow enveloped me, swallowing the light from the camera. I felt a crushing weight on my chest, my vision clouding with darkness. The whispers grew louder until they became deafening. "You're not leaving," they said. "You'll never leave." The last thing I saw was the flicker of the camera's lens, the image glitching as I was pulled into the dark. The screen went black, and then there was nothing. The camera was found again days later, buried in the snow. The footage was intact, but no one could explain what had happened to me. No one could explain the strange distortion in the video, or the chilling whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. It was as if the camera itself had recorded a warning to anyone foolish enough to search for the truth. The mountain had claimed me too, just like the others, and it would claim anyone who came after. The legend of the cabin and its curse spread, whispered by those who dared to venture into the mountains. They spoke of the shadow, of the entity that hunted the lost, of the whispers that drove men mad. But no one truly understood. No one knew the mountain's true hunger. And no one ever would, because no one ever returned to tell the tale. The peak would always be waiting, its curse never lifted, its hunger never sated. It was over for me. I had become just another name on the mountain's endless list of victims, lost in the snow, consumed by the very place I had sought to conquer. But it wasn't over for the others. The mountain waits, it watches, and it whispers to those who listen. "Come closer," it says. "There is room for more." No one is ever truly safe from the shadow of the peak, not once you've seen it. And so, the story ends. But if you find yourself near the base of the mountain, and you hear the wind calling your name, listen closely. If you hear the whispers, if you feel the shadow behind you, turn away, for the mountain is always hungry, and it will not let you go.